Okay, let's go ahead and get started. So, hi everyone. Oh, let me minimize that to get my picture out of the way. Can everyone see my screen okay?
Yep.
Okay, great. So we probably won't go the full time today. I don't have all that much for us to talk about, but the topic of the day is political philosophy, or the state of nature in particular, about John Locke and Thomas Hobbes. Let's get started with the attendance question for the day. The attendance question is this question. Hopefully the relevance to the reading will be clear. Are rights, I mean like basic human rights, the kinds of things we champion as rights here in America, are they innate or are they merely social constructions for the sake of our mutual well-being? So go ahead and answer that on the class discussion board, which is right here, module 23. So try to do that sooner the better, but by the end of the day would be great. And let's dive into the topic. So in the modern period, in fact, throughout all of human history for that matter, the question of the purpose of government has been important. What is sort of the proper purpose of government? What should the ideal form of government be based on the kinds of creatures we are? And in the modern period in particular, modern philosophers who are thinking about political philosophy, they developed this or sort of relied on this theory of the state of nature. And the state of nature is kind of an interesting concept because it's supposed to be man's natural state, man absent government, man left to his own devices, talking about basic features of human nature. And their view about political philosophy is supposed to fall out of or be a consequence of their view of the state of nature. And there are really two ways of looking at this. In the modern time period, philosophers who were writing about the state of nature, Locke and Hobbes in particular, but there were others, they were attempting to give historical accounts of primitive mankind as a way of justifying their political philosophy. And it's not clear at all whether if they really believe that this was man's natural state historically, and that their view of political philosophy and the ideal government is a consequence of that historical natural state. You could also look at the state of nature from a postmodern mindset. You know, we spent the last couple of class sessions talking about narratives and meta-narratives, kind of narratives within a culture, within a time period, within a society. And one way of looking at these accounts of the state of nature is to read them as fictional narratives that are used to justify a political philosophy. I think we know a lot more now about about the evolution and history of mankind historically and sociologically and politically and archaeologically. It's an interesting question, though. You know, to what extent are these states of nature historically accurate or an accurate account of our natural state outside of society, primitive man? Outside of civilized society, as Hobbes called it, and to what extent those states of nature, those accounts of the state of nature, are merely fictional narratives. And if they're merely fictional narratives, does that undercut the political philosophy that they are used to justify? So as you encounter these different political philosophies and these accounts of the state of nature, have this in mind. You know, to what extent are they historical? To what extent are these accounts merely fictional? And does it even matter? Are these accounts of man's natural state necessary for justifying the political philosophy that they're supposed to entail? Or can we kind of dispense with these notions of the state of nature as almost anachronisms at this point? I think anyone writing in political philosophy these days is not going to try to give some fictional account of man's natural state and justify your political philosophy in terms of that. They're going to justify political philosophy in terms of something else, and we can talk about later in the class. So the two philosophers we're going to look at today are John Locke and Thomas Hobbes, two of the prominent philosophers political philosophers of the modern period. And they have really diametrically opposite views of the state of nature and of political philosophy and of the purpose of government. Let's start with John Locke. Everyone's familiar with John Locke. I mean, John Locke is to some extent where we get the phrase life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, although for Locke it was life, liberty, and property or estate. The basic idea behind John Locke, and you can see why Many people consider John Locke to be one of the founding philosophers of our American society. Thomas Jefferson, to some extent, relied on John Locke's concepts in authoring the Declaration of Independence. But the idea behind John Locke is that human rights are innate. Even in man's natural state, man left to his own devices has innate, inalienable rights. And for Locke, that includes things like life, liberty, and estate. He says as much in the second treatise of government that I asked you guys to read for today. He says it should be obvious to human reason that man left to his own devices has a right to life, a life to liberty, and a right to property, the things that he owns. And he thinks of this as just a fundamental principle of reason. And you can see why he would think then that rights are innate. I think an important thing for understanding John Locke is he has a fairly agrarian, what I would call a pastoral view of the state of nature. If you are a hunter or a gatherer, or if you're a sort of primitive farmer tilling the land, his basic idea is that through the work that you do, the hunting or the gathering or the farming, the raising of animals, whatever it is, you are entitled to the fruits of your own labor, and you build property, you build an estate for yourself, essentially. And you can imagine, so, in early, I want to kind of Americanize this. In early America, in the colonies, people are fairly spread out, except if you're in one of the urban centers. If they're farming, people are hunting. And when people are fairly spread out, living relatively individual lives, this makes a lot of sense, right? If you're hunting and you kill an animal and it's yours to eat, you worked to produce that. You did the hunting, so you're entitled to the fruits of that. If you're gathering food for yourself, going out and gathering acorns, whatever you might do, you're entitled to the fruits of your own labor. You're entitled to the acorns that you gather. Same thing with farming. If you're the one working the land, you become entitled to the fruits of your labor. Again, as an individual left to your own devices outside of civilized society, as an individual in the state of nature as he considers it. So it's a fairly idyllic, again, what I would describe as an agrarian or pastoral view of the state of nature. People left to their own devices, working to survive and being entitled to the things that they produce in terms of ownership. So for Locke, even in the state of nature, one person at a time, out there left to their own devices, people have basic rights: the right to life, the right to liberty, and the right to property that you earn through the fruits of your own labor. This should all sound really familiar. I mean, we're all Americans, so this should resonate with us to some degree. It's an interesting question: what happens with civilized society from there? If a farmer owns a if a plantation owner owns a plantation and hires people to till the land for them, are the people who till the land entitled to the fruits of their labor? It seems like no. The owner of the fruits of that labor is the owner of the plantation, right? So as soon as you get multiple people in the equation in a society where a person isn't just owning the fruits of their immediate labor, owning other things, owning businesses, owning property, owning farms, owning whatever, you can see how an economy emerges from this, right? I own not just the fruits of my own labor, but I own some big stretch of land that other people are tilling, and I pay them and they give me the fruits of their labor. And Adam Smith talks a lot about this in his work, The Wealth of Nations, which is part of our, I would describe as our founding documents for our American economy. But it's definitely related to John Locke's view that we own the fruits of our labor. And if that's not the case, if you're working for someone else, there's an economic trade, right? You're paid and you work for someone else, they pay you, you give them the fruits of the labor of their labor, and an economy emerges out of that. So for Locke, there's an intrinsic challenge to civilized society. Once you add other people into the equation, there's always the danger that your rights are going to be in question. Your life will be threatened. Your liberty will be questioned. The ownership of your property will be threatened. People trying to undercut your rights to these things. So for Locke, this is a very important thing to understand about Locke. The purpose of government is to preserve your innate rights, your right to life, your right to liberty, and your right to property and your estate, which for him are natural rights in the state of nature, even outside of civilized society. So civilized society for Locke is somewhat threatening to our basic innate rights. And the role of government for him is to protect these basic rights that are in danger in civilized society. I think it's a pretty easy view for us to understand as Americans. We largely hold this view that we have inalienable innate rights, life, liberty. Of course, in the Declaration of Independence, it was modified to be life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. But the original phrase from Locke was life, liberty, and property. But again, these views should be really intuitive. In contrast to that is the view of Thomas Hobbes. Thomas Hobbes also gave a view of the state of nature, but it was not as happy and pastoral and idyllic and agrarian of a view as John Locke's view. For Thomas Hobbes, the state of nature, man left to his own devices, and this is a direct quote from Thomas Hobbes. It's like the quote to understand Thomas Hobbes. The state of nature is solitary, poor, nasty, brutish, and short. This is a very different view of man's natural state than John Locke. For John Locke, he's saying, people left to their own devices, they're going to feed themselves, they're going to hunt, they're going to gather, they're going to farm. People are spread out. It's individuals living out there on the frontier in some sense, but it's very idyllic and calm and not very threatening. For Thomas Hobbes, our natural state is a dark place where you don't want to be. It's alone, you're poor, it's nasty and dirty, it's brutish and short. He describes it as a war of all against all, a war of everyone against everyone. And I want you guys to do a thought experiment. And it's funny we're doing this in the time of the coronavirus pandemic because we can do kind of a funny spin on this. But suppose that there were two people locked in a room and there's only so much food to go around. There's a pile of food in the middle. One person decides to sleep on one side of the room and another person decides to sleep on the other side of the room. And again, maybe there's a week worth of food inside the room and that's it. You've got to survive. What is that going to digress into very, very quickly? Anyone?
Fighting over the food.
Fighting over the food, exactly, very quickly. It's not a place where you want to be. You couldn't sleep well, right? If you tried to go to sleep, you'd be worried about the other person taking your food, maybe murdering you in your sleep, and whatnot. And this is Thomas Hobbes's view of the state of nature. It's a state where even if you own some property, even if you're sustaining yourself, there's always someone to kill you, take your property, end your life, and you're in a constant state of fear. It's a war of everyone against everyone. Nowhere near as positive and optimistic and idyllic as John Locke's view of the state of nature. And this is a very important thing to understand for Hobbes, that fear is the primary motivator. And you can see why. If you're in a constant state of fear, if life is solitary, poor, nasty, brutish, and short in the state of nature, that's a state of constantly being afraid of having your resources taken from you, of not having enough to survive, of someone else out to get you. And if that's your view of man's natural state, that's the primary motivator, and that's the thing you need to get outside of. So again, I want to draw attention to the contrast between Locke and Hobbes here. For Locke, the goal is to preserve the things that we have in the state of nature: life, liberty, property ownership, and this kind of idyllic state, even in civilized society. And the role of government is to preserve all of those aspects of our natural state that are threatened by civilized society. Hobbes is saying something related but slightly different. He's saying that our natural state is not very idyllic. It's a place where people are constantly afraid of the qualities that he just described. Like Locke, he's saying that, yeah, we do want to preserve our property and we do want to preserve our lives, but the goal is not to return to the state of nature. The goal is to get outside of the state of nature and eliminate the fear. And so, again, kind of relying on this hypothetical example of two people in a room with not enough food, what would you do? What would be in the best interest of everyone in that room? And this is not a difficult thought experiment. If someone wants to just chime in and answer, what would be the best way to extend your life in that situation? Anyone.
Maybe set up some rules and talk about rations and kind of put a plan in place instead of feeling like immediately like it's me against them. I need to get as much as I can because I want to survive, and that's the main goal.
That's it exactly. The two people in that room, in order to
Mhm.
survive, the smartest thing for them to do would be to sit down and hammer out an agreement. I won't take, let's partition the food. I won't take yours. You won't take mine. We won't kill each other in our sleep. And we'd start to form the basis of a primitive society, the fundamental rules that will govern that miniature society. And this is an interesting way to think about it. It's almost it's kind of a hypothetical thought experiment. This is like a proto society. What people would do in that situation is start to form rules, principles, laws, agreements, all for the purpose of eliminating the fear of the state of nature to preserve their property, preserve their lives, and get outside of that natural state. Um, there's a term that comes from Hobbes called social contract. And Hobbes's view of government is that it's a form of social contract. We basically band together and form agreements for the purpose of making ourselves safer, more secure, and eliminating the fear of our natural state. Excuse me. Um, so this theory of government is called social contract theory, as opposed to Locke. Locke doesn't think that government is a type of social contract. The purpose of government is to preserve our innate, inalienable rights. It's not merely a matter of forming these fairly arbitrary agreements to eliminate our fear. It's to preserve something that's innate to all of us. But for Hobbes, any of the principles of government, the rights, the principles, laws, agreements, any contracts, any of those things are for the purpose of getting outside the state of nature. This has a really interesting consequence that for Hobbes, there's no such thing as morality inside the state of nature. The state of nature, again, for him, is solitary, poor, nasty, brutish, and short. There's no such thing as morality in the state of nature. It's a war of everyone against everyone. And that sounds, I think it can be a little counterintuitive to some people. If you have a Lockean view of morality and of government, you're going to think that there's morality and there are rights even in the state of nature. So you're always entitled to your life. You should always try to preserve the lives of other people. But what Hobbes is saying is no. Our natural state is everyone against everyone, me versus you, one person in the room versus another person in the room, duking it out, trying to survive. It's like, I'm trying to think of a good analogy. It's like if you get attacked and someone's trying to kill you, Hobbes would say you're every bit justified in trying to preserve your own life and kill the other person if it's you versus them. This is how we think of warfare. If it's us versus them, then we're justified in killing people for the sake of preserving our own society. Morality doesn't apply in that natural state when it's everyone against everyone, or your life versus someone else's life. You're back into trying to preserve your own life at all costs, and morality doesn't apply. So for Hobbes, morality and all of these governmental concepts, rights and laws and all the things that Locke thought were innate, are to some extent arbitrary constructions that only exist in civilized societies. And by civilized societies, he means when people start to group together and form agreements and laws for the purpose of building a safer, more secure existence than that state of nature that they're desperately trying to get out of because of the fear of that state of nature. What this means for Hobbes, and again, I want to drive home these fundamental contrasts between Locke and Hobbes. For Locke, the purpose of government is to preserve our liberty, preserve our life, preserve our property, not to give up those things. Giving up those things would be going against our natural state. For Hobbes, he's saying the exact opposite. He's saying that what we do when we band together to make societies, when we form proto-societies, when we form social contracts, he's saying we voluntarily give up our freedoms, give up our liberties for the sake of security. In man's natural state, I think he agrees to some extent with Locke. He's saying our natural state is somewhat free. It's just not a very good place to be. If you're out there on your own, constantly afraid of having your property stolen, having your food taken, being killed by someone who's trying to gather the resources you've got, that's a kind of freedom. It's just not a very ideal freedom. It's not a safe way of existing. It's a constant state of fear. He says, so what we do then is we voluntarily give up some of our freedom that we do have in the state of nature for the sake of security and safety and building a more comfortable place to be than that state of nature. This is where Hobbes gets a little strange, and I've always kind of struggled with this intellectual leap that he makes in the Leviathan. There's a reason that it's called Leviathan, Leviathan meaning this kind of all-powerful sovereign. He basically says, I want you to follow his reasoning on this. He says that if fear is the primary motivator, he then asks, what is the kind of ideal society? What kind of society would best allow us to eliminate the fear? If you imagine a democratic society, that, you know, the kind of society that we have based on John Locke's views, Hobbes is going to say, no, that really isn't adequate to overcome the fear. You know, think about this, you know, if you live in a world of nation states, our country versus all the other countries in the world, and there have been periods of time like this, you know, the periods of civil war or periods of world wars, World War I, World War II, Vietnam War, whatnot. Hobbes is going to say that the best way to deal with that situation, to keep your nation safe from the rest of the world, is to have a very powerful government, a sovereign power who can rally the resources necessary to wage war against other societies, to keep invaders at bay, in other words. So for Hobbes, you want a government or a sovereign power that is somewhat all-powerful, has the power to do whatever is necessary to keep that society safe. You could immediately say then, well, if you have an all-powerful sovereign, say a king or an emperor who's in charge of society, invested with all of this power, you know, in some sense that creates a safe, civilized society. If you can keep all the invaders at bay, you have a kind of security inside that society. But what about the sovereign himself? Isn't the sovereign or the emperor or the king constantly in fear of being usurped or murdered by his subjects who want to take his place? I mean, you've seen this happen. Like, you know, the murder of Julius Caesar on the Ides of March comes to mind, right? You know, someone's always ready to take your place. And people are constantly afraid of what the sovereign can do if the sovereign is genuinely all powerful. So this is kind of a trade-off that Hobbes thinks that we have to make. He says that the safest kind of society is one in which the subjects of a society, the average citizens or the average members of a society, voluntarily give up as much freedom necessary to invest the king or the emperor or the sovereign power with as much power as that sovereign can have to keep everyone safe. He thinks this is the only way to eliminate fear. And if you kind of go down the list, you can see why he might think this. Who is the sovereign afraid of in that situation? Well, if people are always voluntarily giving up their own liberties and giving up their own freedoms to invest that sovereign with power, and people are doing this not begrudgingly, but voluntarily for the sake of their own safety and their own security, in theory, the sovereign should have nothing to fear because all of his or her subjects have given up their freedom and given up their liberty, invested that sovereign with radical power, in unlimited power. The people in turn wouldn't have anything to fear. If the sovereign has no fear, the sovereign would have no reason to be a harsh ruler to the people that he or she is ruling. If the sovereign isn't afraid of being killed or being murdered or being usurped, then the sovereign would have no reason to use that power in a top-down, thumbs-down kind of way over the subjects. And of course, the sovereign is what's necessary to keep foreign invaders at bay, to basically wage war against other societies when necessary. So for Hobbes, this is the best possible society. It's not democratic like it was for Locke. He's basically talking about a monarchy, a radical monarchy, where the monarch is invested with complete and utter and total power, both to wage war and over everyone in society. Subjects would have nothing to fear because the subjects don't have to worry about invaders because the sovereign is going to take care of waging war when necessary. In fact, we rely on this in our society even now. we trust the fact that our government, our military, will wage war as necessary against other societies to secure our own general well-being here in America. Every society with a military relies on this concept to some extent. But the idea is that what you want is a radical power, a sovereign power with radical and total authority to wage war, and also to take care of any unrest inside of society. That means the general population won't have anything to fear because the sovereign isn't afraid of anything. The sovereign isn't afraid of being killed. The sovereign isn't afraid of being usurped. The sovereign can wage war against other societies. And for Hobbes, this is kind of the balance of power that eliminates fear. Keep the invaders at bay, have an all-powerful ruler who can make whatever decisions are necessary to ensure the safety of the overall population, and everyone else voluntarily giving up their liberties and investing, basically transferring those liberties to the sovereign for the sake of creating a secure and safe society. So if you're looking for like strong contrasts in political philosophy, the contrast between Locke and Hobbes is the strongest contrast you'll find. Locke is saying we have innate, inalienable rights and liberties. The purpose of government, therefore, is to preserve those rights and liberties, not to escape them, not to get outside of them. We don't voluntarily give up our liberties. The purpose is to try to preserve those liberties that we have inside our natural state. But Hobbes is saying the exact opposite. He's saying the state of nature is not very ideal. As he says, it's solitary, poor, nasty, brutish, and short. It's a war of everyone against everyone. Everyone is constantly afraid. And the fundamental psychological motivator for Hobbes then is fear. The purpose of government is to eliminate the fear of the state of nature. But for Hobbes, the only way to do that is not to try to preserve our liberties and preserve our natural rights. It's to voluntarily give up our rights and give up our liberties for the sake of having a civilized society. Again, Hobbes takes it to an extreme. He says the only way to do this is to have an all-powerful sovereign who can wage war against any invaders to take care of any unrest inside society. And he really takes it to an extreme level. And I think it's this extremity of Thomas Hobbes that makes him a little hard to swallow from our American standpoints. When you first encounter Hobbes, you go, wait a minute, this is crazy. We're Americans. We like rights and we don't want to give up our liberties. So how can Hobbes be right? But I think you could plausibly say that every time we pass a law for the general well-being of society, this is really what's going on. We're giving up some sort of freedom, some sort of liberties for the sake of the general well-being, or to maximize the liberty and maximize the extent of other people's rights, not just focusing on one person's rights. So every time we pass a law, I think you could plausibly say that this is what's going on. We're giving up some sort of freedom, some sort of liberty for the overall quality of the society that we have. And if you bring Hobbes down a notch, if you abandon the notion of a monarch, a radical totalitarian power, a benevolent dictator, I guess you could think of the sovereign for Hobbes as a kind of benevolent dictator, a person with radical power, but who uses that power for good because they have nothing to fear from anyone else, either from outside invaders or from people inside of society. But if you bring that down a notch, if you abandon the totalitarianism of Thomas Hobbes, I think you can really plausibly say that this is what we do in society all the time. Every time Congress passes a law, every time a society gets together and says, let's form some rules for us all to agree by, let's get back to that simple example of two people inside the state of nature, two people in a room with a certain amount of food. What those people are doing when they agree not to kill each other and not to take each other's food is giving up some of their liberty. They're sacrificing some of their freedom to do whatever they want for their own survival, for the overall well-being, for the well-being of everyone inside that society. So I think for Hobbes, this happens at the micro level in these sort of proto-societies that he has in mind, but it happens on the macro scale. Every society that has laws or rules, where those rules are voluntarily agreed upon in the sense of the social contract that he has in mind, that's a matter of giving up some individual liberty for the sake of overall well-being. And I think since the beginning of time, from Plato and Aristotle and philosophy, since the beginning of every society has had to deal with this issue. What's the relation between the individual and society as a whole? Individualism and collectivism. What's the tension between your individual rights and the rights of other people that live alongside you within your society? The tension between your own rights and liberties and the overall well-being of society as a whole. This is a fundamental tension in political philosophy that will never go away, but has manifested itself in countless ways in the course of human history. I want to dive in and look at some specific examples and talk about some discussion points, but I want to pause for a moment and see if any of you guys have any questions about what Locke or Hobbes is saying, the difference between their view, or what that means for them or what it means for us today. Are there any questions at this point before we move on?
So I guess I have a question.
Sure.
Would you say that like Hobbes and Locke are kind of like not like almost similar to like the Darwin theory of like survival of the fittest?
I think Hobbes is definitely similar
Okay.
because Hobbes is saying, again, kind of once again, you have in proto-society, in our state of nature, there is no society. It's a matter of individuals waging war against each other. So yeah, whoever's able to get the food, get the shelter, and able to defend him or herself against whatever invaders are out there, whether in the natural world or other human beings, those are the people that are going to survive. And so the state of nature for him is one of sheer brute survival, which is not a very pleasant place to be. I mean, it's like being out, imagine if I just took you guys out to Yellowstone and dropped you in the middle of the grizzly bear zone and said, go survive. Yeah. Now imagine there aren't just grizzly bears there, but there are other humans trying to kill you and take your food. I think of it kind of like a good contemporary example that I encountered not too long ago was the Hunger Games, the book and the movie. It's kind of the Hunger Games is the kind of situation that Hobbes has in mind, or maybe Lord of the Flies even. A state where you're constantly afraid of other people killing you and taking your resources, and that, on an individual level, there's no such thing in society. It's sheer survival. So in that sense, I would say Hobbes is very close to that Darwinian mindset that, of course, he's not talking about evolution. He's talking about mere survival, right? Yeah. But you can't rely on society to protect you. You can't rely on your neighbor to protect you. You can't rely on your family to protect you. It's everyone against everyone. Mere survivals. So again, Lord of the Flies, Hunger Games, state of nature. It's not a very good place to be. It is Darwinian in that sense. It's, it is the survival of the fittest. Whoever can get the best shelter and hoard the most food and protect themselves from whatever invaders there are, other people or the natural world, whatnot, those are the people that are going to survive. So that's very similar to Darwin. Locke, not so much. Again, I think of Locke as being a bit more idyllic and pastoral. He thinks of man's natural state as one in which we can survive pretty well using our own rationality and using our own resources. We can farm the land, we can hunt, we can gather. We're more intelligent than all the beasts around us. We're able to find food pretty adequately. We're able to feed ourselves. If you're looking for an analogy, we're going to read this very shortly. We're going to read Thoreau's Walden. Imagine Henry David Thoreau building a cabin for himself next to Walden Pond, fishing from the pond, growing his own food, maybe trading with his neighbors who live, a mile away, but he doesn't have to worry about them very much. His neighbors basically leave him alone. That is, to some extent, Locke's picture of man's natural state. It's not one where you have to worry very much. We're able to farm the land, and we're able to gather and hunt, and we're able to trade with our neighbors. So we don't have to worry very much because we're rational beings who are able to take care of ourselves pretty well left to our own devices. But for Hobbes, he's saying, no, our natural state is one in constant fear. We're constantly being threatened by the natural world. We're constantly being threatened by our neighbors. We're constantly afraid of our own demise. We're afraid of our resources being taken and stolen from us. So just complete opposite views of the state of nature. So, excuse me, I don't think of Locke as being very similar to Darwin at all, because Locke is saying that man left to his own devices is able to survive pretty well on his own. But Hobbes is saying, no, we're a pretty weak creature, and you put us out there on our own, life is going to be, as he describes, I love the phrase, it's really quotable. Solitary, it means you're alone. Poor, you don't have very much. Nasty, you're constantly, you're dirty and you're uncivilized and you're, kind of scraping by. Brutish, so it's constant warfare and constant struggle, and life is short. You just don't live very long because of those things. And so what we do is band together and form societies. We basically form societies and social contracts as a way of escaping that. That's a good way to put it. It's a Darwinian state where it's a war of everyone against everyone, trying to survive as well as possible. So we form societies to survive. But for Locke, our natural state is fairly idyllic. You want to preserve those qualities of our natural state. And if anything, societies threaten our natural state. So it's a matter of returning to our natural state or returning to a state of nature for Locke. That's a really good question, though. I hadn't really considered that Hobbes is essentially giving a Darwinian view of human nature, that it's a war of everyone against everyone, mere survival, and whoever is able to get resources, food, shelter, and weaponry maybe, or security and safety by being able to wage war when necessary. Those are the people and the societies that are going to survive. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, it does.
Good.
Thank you.
Any other questions before we move on? Okay. So I want to consider just a minute a postmodern way of looking at this. Now, I mentioned this at the beginning of class, but if you're a modern philosopher, if you are Locke or you are Hobbes or you're a political philosopher inside the modern period, and again, the modern period meaning roughly from Descartes through Kant, even though Lyotard, when he talks about the modern mindset, he thinks that really persists all the way into like the mid 20th century. But really in philosophy, the modern period means from Descartes to Kant. One way of looking at what's going on in this political philosophy of Locke and Hobbes is to read it as a type of narrative. In fact, that's really what they're doing. Locke is telling you a certain story about the origin of mankind, what mankind is like in his natural state, and how societies form and what the purpose of society is. What Lyotard would call a meta-narrative. It's a narrative that doesn't just focus on the immediate aspects of that story, but that frames all of society and the purpose of society in some broader, grander narrative. And of course, Locke and Hobbes are doing it in two different ways. We as Americans read Locke and we go, oh, well, obviously, if we have innate rights like life, liberty, and property, or as we would say now, life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, the purpose of society is to preserve people's lives and their rights. And that's why we have the democratic society we have, or the Republican society we have. Same thing with Hobbes. He's telling you a story. Imagine man's natural state. It's a war of everyone against everyone. He's telling you it's not history. It's not archaeology. It's not sociology. It's a narrative. It's a story that's designed to draw you in and make you sympathetic to his overall political philosophy. So within the modern period, these aren't narratives. These aren't mere stories. They think they're doing history. They think they're doing archaeology. They think they're doing sort of pure political philosophy, where those accounts of the state of nature aren't fictional. They aren't made up. They aren't hypothetical. They really think that is human nature, and that's man left to their own devices. And Locke and Hobbes disagree about that, of course. And of course, disciplines like archaeology and history have made immense progress since Locke and Hobbes. But I don't think that's enough to settle it. I think each one of them really has a fundamentally different view about human nature, mankind left to his own devices outside of civilized society. But if you're looking at this from the postmodern mindset, what they're really doing is storytelling, telling you a story of humanity, telling you a story of human nature, framing all of society and the trajectory of society towards some purpose or towards some goal. For Locke, it's the preservation of our innate liberties, and all of society should be geared towards the preservation of these qualities of the state of nature. For Hobbes, it's this really dramatic. It really is the Hunger Games. It has the dramatic quality of a movie or a book like the Hunger Games, a war of everyone against everyone, struggling for survival. In fact, you mentioned Darwin. If you read Darwin dramatically, it has all the things you want from a good drama, right? It has struggle and catharsis and survival and all of these things that define good drama. But it's a story, it's a narrative. but it's a meta-narrative because it's not just a story. It's a story that frames all of society, tells us where society should be heading. And Locke and Hobbes have fundamentally different views about the trajectory of an ideal society, what form of government we should have based on these qualities of human nature. But from a postmodern mindset, when you read accounts of the state of nature, a postmodern philosopher or thinker is not going to read that as history or read it as fact or read it as sociology, read it as an objective account of human nature. They're going to read it as a narrative that's used to justify to some extent what the endpoint has already been decided on. Locke already has a certain kind of society in mind, and Hobbes already has a certain kind of ideal society in mind. And what they're doing is telling you a story to justify what the end point is, and of course to promote that, to get their political ideas out there in the world by telling a compelling story that draws people in. And I guess from that point of view, viewing the state of nature as a kind of storytelling, the question that I have for you guys, and I'd love if a couple of you would chime in, maybe everyone, but that might be asking a lot for this online class. Which story do you find more compelling? Which one seems more historically accurate? Which one seems to be a better reflection of man's natural state? Again, conceiving of our natural state as a human left to his or her own devices, apart or outside of or before the emergence of civilized societies. If there ever even was a time, and I think this is the kind of specious part of Locke and Hobbes' reasoning. You could plausibly say that humans have always banded together. We've always lived in tribes. We've always lived in groups. We've never had this fiction of a lone human out there on his or her own, on the frontier, very far apart from civilized societies. Yes, you can point to individuals like Thoreau, or maybe like Call of the Wild, a person out there just living on the frontier. You can point to people like that, but they're the exceptions. They aren't the norm. So you might even say just this hypothetical consideration of a lone person in the state of nature and what human nature is apart from society is already a kind of fiction that's never been historically accurate, insofar as humans have always banded together in groups, from what we can tell in the archaeological record from, say, physical anthropology, even. And cultural anthropology. But again, this is a question for you guys. So go ahead and unmute, and I just love if a couple of you guys would share your thoughts on this. Which view of human nature do you find more compelling, either historically or as a view of human nature?
I think you're absolutely right that people would be solitary only in individual cases. I don't think many of them would do that. But organized society is at least some kind of organization, some kind of rules. That's probably been around since the dawn of man, because we're not the strongest. We need a lot of us to take down some bigger animals.
If only to get enough food to eat sometimes.
Yeah.
So which sort of political philosophy do you find yourself more attracted to? Again, this is a fundamentally different view of the nature of government. Is the purpose of government to preserve the things that are innate to our natural states, or should we give up parts of our natural state for the purpose of having a secure and safe society? Two very different ways of looking at government.
It's a really tough question. In some ways, it's part of the society and government is so that you don't have to do survival type things, but in the same way, it sort of amplifies that. Your ability to work towards your survival instead of fight for it.
This is part of the reason that when the founding fathers were drafting a constitution, they discovered fairly quickly that what had been left out was what we could now know as the Bill of Rights. They had talked a lot about how laws are formed, the collective good of society, the different branches of government, whatnot. What they had left out was the individual and the individual liberty, the individual freedom. So now you've got this fundamental tension. How do we form laws for which are, again, from Hobbes' standpoint, a social contract? What kinds of agreements do we make, and how do we make them? How do we get together and decide what rules and standards we're all going to live by? On a Lockean view, the purpose of that is to preserve our natural rights. But what they had left out was, what are those rights? which parts of human nature do we find innate and inalienable and are going to be overriding factors? And now you've got this fundamental tension between the collective good of society and individual rights. And this seems so obvious to, I think, any student of government or politics, but and anyone who's thought about the nature of society for more than a week. This is a fundamental tension that will not go away, right? If you emphasize the collective good too much in the way that Hobbes suggests, for example, what you end up doing is sacrificing individual rights. According to Hobbes, we just give up our individual rights and give up our freedoms and give up our liberties for the collective good. Just like two people who want to survive a little longer inside the state of nature or inside that room with not enough food. But if we also hold that we have innate inalienable rights, now you've got a tension. Insofar as you pass laws for the common good, you're violating someone's innate liberties and someone's innate rights and innate freedoms. And that is a fundamental tension that will not go away. Every time we pass a law for the common good, we're giving up some of our natural freedoms. And every time we emphasize anyone's individual freedoms or individual liberties, you run the risk of making that decision not in the common good for the sake of the individual versus the sake of overall society. I think what's a little unfortunate is that in our political age, where political parties are diametrically opposed, where people have trouble seeing politics from the other side of the aisle, so to speak, I think people forget that this is a tension that won't go away. Like if you're a Republican and you emphasize individual liberty, you're going to have a hard time nowadays kind of understanding the need for collective good, the need to sacrifice some of those freedoms for the collective good. If you're a Democrat and if you have more of a socialist mindset where you think that the purpose of government is to provide safety and security and basic needs of society as a whole, you're going to have a hard time understanding how a single person's individual rights could override the collective good of society as a whole. And I think each side wants to kind of take those two qualities, individualism or collectivism, to an extreme, not recognizing that this is a fundamental tension in any society, in any government, that this is part of the reason that our Constitution is modifiable, right? Because this is a tension that will not go away. Every time we pass a law, you run the risk of sacrificing someone's rights. Every time you're focusing on someone's rights, you run the risk of harming other people or of sacrificing another individual's rights by emphasizing one person's rights. And this is a tension that will not go away. And part of I'm Americanizing this to kind of bring it down to earth for all of you guys. This is part of the role of the Supreme Court for us here in the United States, is to adjudicate, to kind of look at the issues and say, okay, based on these laws and based on these historical precedents and based on these rights, based on the common good, what is that sweet middle ground between preserving people's individual liberties, but also having the public and common good in mind for everyone as a whole, knowing that tension will never be perfect and that tension will never go away. But I think the unfortunate thing is that insofar as our politics have become so polarized, each side has a little trouble understanding the perspective of the other side, recognizing that part of the purpose of our government, the purpose of our Constitution, the purpose of the way we've set up our government here in the United States is to try to find a middle ground between the common good. That's why we have Congress and why we pass laws and why power has been spread out, diversified among the different branches of government, while also emphasizing the rights of the individual. And unfortunately, that means sometimes someone, usually the Supreme Court, has to say, in this particular instance, this is how we find the middle ground between liberty and common good. And that's a tension that will just not go away. So again, any other questions before we move on? I want to talk about some specifics and some examples, but if there are any questions, now's a great time to pause and ask those questions. Okay, nothing heard, so let's go ahead and move on. So I call these discussion questions, but really these are just my own reflections on how these concepts are relevant. I mentioned this already, but this is a fundamental difference of opinion about the purpose of government. I think we sometimes take for granted that there should be a government. And this sounds kind of obvious. Obviously, in a civilized society, there has to be a government. But a really important question, maybe not so much for us nowadays, because we a lot of these decisions have been made for us, right? We're here, close to 250 years after the Declaration of Independence. Our country's been around for almost 250 years. Our government's largely in place. There have been some minor modifications to it, but the structure of our government we largely take for granted as Americans. And I think we forget how innovative the kind of government we have really was. There had never been in the whole history of the world a government quite like ours before the founding fathers got together and made up the government that we have to try to find the balance between individual liberty and collective good, to secure the freedoms that John Locke was talking about, while also recognizing that we have to give up some of those freedoms to have a safe, secure society, to protect ourselves from our rights being violated by a foreign power out there across the ocean. And we forget that that's this fundamental tension. So there have been periods of time where this question has been really important. Put yourself in the position of the founding fathers. We've declared independence from England. We now have the burden of deciding how to set up our government. We could form a new monarchy. We could have a radical democracy like they had in ancient Greece. We could have a republic like they had in ancient Rome. What kinds of government do you have? What are the different positions? How does the government function? How are laws made? How are laws changed? These are fundamental questions that, in their viewpoint, had never been answered historically correctly, the way that they should be, to preserve the balance that they envisioned between individual liberty and the collective good. But it forces you to ask the question, what exactly is the purpose of government? Is the purpose of government to secure individual rights, or is the purpose of government to provide security and safety and be willing to sacrifice an individual's rights or liberty for the purpose of that basic security? This is the difference between Locke and Hobbes. And I guess I want you guys to understand that the society we have now is a hybrid solution. It's both, right? We do care about an individual rights. We've spelled out what we think our innate rights are in the Constitution. The Supreme Court has sometimes said, well, there are other innate rights that are implicit in the Constitution that aren't explicitly mentioned, like the right to privacy is a great example. The Supreme Court has said, well, we have a right to privacy. It's not mentioned explicitly in the Constitution, but in order to provide some of the things that are listed in the Constitution, you have to presume a right to privacy. So that's, again, one of our basic rights, even though it's not delineated explicitly in the Constitution. So whatever those are, one purpose of government is to preserve those. That's why they're enumerated in the Constitution. But we also voluntarily get together in a representative form, because we're a representative government. We're a republic, not a pure democracy. We basically elect representatives to go represent our interests to Congress. Members of Congress in the House of Representatives and in the Senate pass laws for the common good. But every single time that happens, someone's individual liberty is being sacrificed. Someone is losing their freedom to do whatever they want to do for the sake of the common good. And so our founding fathers, I think, wisely said, you can't just have a pure approach one way or the other. You can't have such a radical view of individual liberty that you don't take the common good into account. And you can't take the common good into account so much that you're stepping on everyone's individual liberty. You can't have the kind of totalitarian government that Hobbes had in mind, where people don't have any liberties or have any freedoms, even for the sake of safety and security. So our government isn't a pure approach to this. We don't emphasize individual liberties to an extreme. We don't emphasize the common good to an extreme. Really, we're saying both are important. And that's why we have practical politics. That's why members of the House of Representatives and the Senate duke it out intellectually to decide what laws to pass. That's why we give the president power to veto bills that have been passed by Congress. That's why we give the Supreme Court the power to say, no, this law is unjust, or this law is unconstitutional, or this law violates our innate rights. This kind of checks and balances system is the practical day-to-day, work-a-day approach to finding the balance between individual liberty and the collective good. But I think in our society, we're kind of committed to the view that there is no pure solution to this, despite whatever political parties you belong to might tell you or what you might believe. We generally hold that a pure solution is not good. You know, if you emphasize everyone's individual liberty all the time, basically give every individual radical freedom to live his or her life however the heck they want, you're going to be sacrificing the common good in a lot of instances. We need this social contract notion, this ability that we get together and we form agreements, what rules we're going to live by for the sake of creating a secure, safe, happy, civilized society for everyone. But we also don't want a society that emphasizes the common good so much that we're all of a sudden sacrificing the individual rights and liberties that we do think we hold, these concepts that we've inherited from John Locke. So I guess, you know, what do I want you to take away? I just want you to take away that this is that the society we live in is, you know, the practical day-to-day politics that we have are designed to find a balance between these two opposing forces politically. And you can see, you know, Locke and Hobbes, if you take them to the logical extreme, you end up with two very different kinds of governments, neither of which is really reflective of the kind of government that we have. Yeah, it's interesting that we settled on a republic. You know, you could imagine what would happen if we had a pure democracy, if every single person had the ability to vote on every single issue. That's a very different kind of society than the Republican society that we have. That's a very different society than a monarchy, where the monarch is invested with absolute authority to provide for the common good, where individual rights and liberties are underemphasized. Even in a constitutional monarchy, there's this tension between the inherent power of the monarchy and the constitutional authority that invests the monarch with power in the first place. So in any kind of society you have, this is a tension. And I think, you know, the American view has been that we've got the best balance between these two opposing forces, that other forms of societies don't find a balance that's adequate, you know, not for our American mindset anyway. You know, excuse me. A question that arises from this, and this is a question that comes up again and again. I've seen it come up a couple of times in the course of my lifetime in historical events, but it's a question that comes up all the time. Another way of framing this issue is, how much freedom should we be willing to give up for the purpose of our safety and security? A lot of you guys are fairly young. You know, I'm 41, so I was an adult and in grad school when September 11th happened in 2001. Some of you guys might not even be old enough to remember. Some might have happened before a couple of you were born. I remember, I'm going to tell you a little story that it's an anecdote, but I think it's relevant. I remember the day that September 11th occurred. It was my first year of grad school at Syracuse University in New York. And I was a TA for an ethics class. It was my very first time as a teaching assistant. It wasn't even teaching my own class. I was a teacher assistant for another Professor Lawrence Thomas from Syracuse. And class was canceled. Once it became clear what was going on, that a fairly large terrorist attack had occurred. People didn't know what else was coming that day. And I, again, just kind of set the scene. I was in New York, not in New York City, but I was in upstate New York. So I had students then that had, say, parents in the city or family members that lived in the city. There was kind of an atmosphere of panic about it. It wasn't some abstract event happening somewhere else. I was in New York State where this event was happening. Class was canceled, but a few people showed up. The instructor was there. I and a couple of other teaching assistants were there. A few students showed up to this enormous lecture hall. And all of us kind of, rather than having class, we decided to kind of sit on the stage of this lecture hall. And I remember very vividly the instructor, Lawrence Thomas, saying then something to this effect. I won't be able to quote him exactly, but this was the gist of it. He said, "Make no mistake about it. The fundamental question from here on out will be, how much freedom are we willing to give up for the sake of our security and safety, to make sure this kind of event doesn't happen again?" And certain things in society have changed. Like, for example, I mean, everyone kind of knows this, but if you didn't grow up with it, you may not appreciate the difference. Like, one obvious thing that's changed is that before September 11th, if you went to the airport, you used to be able to walk right up to the gate. If you were seeing someone off, you could see them right up to the gate and get on the plane. If someone was getting off a plane, you could walk right up to the gate, to the door of the gate, and meet them when they got off the plane. That's changed. That hasn't been true now for 19 years. That's a huge change. It's a type of liberty that we used to have that is no longer available for the sake of our security or safety. Most people, I think that's a pretty good trade-off. If that means we don't have to worry about planes getting hijacked and another instance like September 11th happening again, that's a trade-off we can generally live with. But I'm thinking of like more recent events. We're living right now. It's fascinating. This is happening right now in the time of the what will be known as the coronavirus pandemic. Think of all the liberties that we're giving up right now. Governments are saying, people don't get together in groups more than, 50 or 10 in some places. Businesses, only essential services are being allowed to function. Other businesses have to shut down or provide remote services. And different states are approaching this in different ways. Some are legislating it and some are just kind of providing guidelines. But we're living in a time when we're all voluntarily giving up some of our freedoms and some of our liberties for the sake of the overall good, so the virus doesn't spread and so more people don't die. And I guess the fundamental question is, how much liberty, what kinds of liberties, and how much are we willing to give up for the sake of the overall good, for the sake of overall society? When will we have taken it too far and we'll have sacrificed too much of our individual liberty and too much freedom? Everyone is saying, of course, this is temporary, right? The fear and panic about the virus will go away. We'll get the virus under control. But I'll bet money, I'll put money right now that some of these social practices that we've had, social liberties, ways of interacting with each other, will change. That when we look back on this in 20 years, we'll be able to point to this time period right now as a time period where we realize we need to sacrifice some of our liberties for the sake of the common good. But how much is too far? When have we sacrificed too much liberty or too much freedom? When have we over legislated to the point where we're sacrificing some of those innate, inalienable, basic human rights that we do believe in as Americans? And how much of that is a perfectly valid way of providing safety and security for society, just like not being able to go meet someone at the gate at the airport anymore? It's not obvious at all. I think, in 20 years or 30 years or 100 years, we'll look back and we'll kind of know, did we make good trade-offs for the sake of the common good, or did we sacrifice too much liberty and too much freedom for the sake of the common good? But again, this, in my mind, this is just a fundamental tension. This issue will not go away. Every time there's a major event where the common good is threatened, every time you've got a case of one person's rights against another person's rights, this issue will crop up. And it's not something you can just legislate away, and definitely not something your political party will answer for you. This is a question that society has faced since the dawn of time and will continue to face every time there's a major historical event that affects the rights and liberties of the general population or the overall welfare of the population. So I'm curious how it will be seen historically in 10 years or 20 years or 50 years, long after I'm gone, 100 years from now. But you can point to these historical events. Like, for example, another good example might be the internment of Japanese Americans in World War II. In World War II, after Pearl Harbor, there was a scare that maybe America had been infiltrated by Japanese spies. So Americans rounded up Japanese Americans, put them in what are essentially concentration camps. We didn't murder them, but basically isolated them for the sake of the overall safety and security, to alleviate this threat of Japanese spies here in America after Pearl Harbor. Now we look back at that and say that was sacrificing too much liberty. That was overemphasizing the common good and sacrificing the individual rights of Japanese Americans. It was too extreme. But that's the same kind of thing that happens in not being able to go to the gate at the airport. We're sacrificing individual liberty for the sake of the common good. Some ways of doing that seem natural and right and healthy and not too big of a sacrifice. And some of those things seem unjust, like interring Japanese Americans after Pearl Harbor. That seems like it's a too extreme approach to that. But again, every major historical event, this issue seems to crop up. And I think if you naively say, well, I'm a Republican, so I emphasize individual rights, or I'm a Democrat, so we emphasize the common good, or any way of characterizing the differences between political parties in any extreme fashion, you're not doing justice to the inherent tension that exists between the individual and the common good, or one person's rights and another person's rights, or what I put on the screen here as individualism versus collectivism. This is an irreducible tension in any society. And, as Americans, I think we're trying to find the best balance between those two opposing forces in a way that the way it's characterized by individual political parties is too extreme, too simplistic, too naive, and not nuanced enough in understanding that this is an inherent tension in any society, that the whole purpose of our American society in the first place was to try to find the balance between those two competing factors. Another question I have here is what to do about conflicting rights. This is an issue that comes up again and again. Every time you emphasize one person's rights, you run the risk of stepping on the toes of another person who has a competing right. And as you go down the Bill of Rights or any other right that we think we hold, there's always the danger that those rights are going to conflict with each other. That every time you emphasize one of those rights for one person, you're going to conflict with a competing right, a different right of another person. And again, this is why we have certain mechanisms in our government. This is why we have the ability to take things to the Supreme Court and have them adjudicated, to decide whose rights get priority when there's a case of conflicting rights. I guess my point is just that it's naive to think that all of these rights are coherent and unified, and that I can have all of the rights in the Bill of Rights and in the Constitution, and you can have all of the rights in the Bill of Rights and in the Constitution, and think that there will never be any conflict between my rights and your rights. If you think, yes, I've got all of those rights and you have all of those rights, when it comes to practical matters, sometimes two people have to get together and agree what to do, or the government will have to pass a law, or the court will have to adjudicate whose rights get priority in the case of conflicting rights. So again, it's a very kind of idyllic, or I guess idyllic is the best word. It's idyllic in the sense of John Locke to think that we have all these innate inalienable rights, all of us as individuals, and that there will never be cases of competing rights where those rights don't clash and conflict with each other. Again, I think this is part of the reason that our government is wisely set up to provide mechanisms for adjudicating these cases. The entire judicial branch, part of its purpose is to decide what to do in these cases of conflicting rights. And it's naive to think that those cases won't exist. And our government is wisely, I think, set up supposedly to handle those kinds of cases. But anytime there's a decision, I think this is the frustrating thing about practical politics and about our form of government. Insofar as our form of government is designed to find the balance between the individual and the collective good, to adjudicate between conflicting rights, there's never going to be a solution that makes everyone happy. Every time the Supreme Court makes a decision, it's basically saying, here's what has to take priority in this situation for the sake of the common good, while taking into account everyone's individual rights. And that inherently means that someone is going to end up on the short end of the stick every single time one of these decisions is made in a case that's worthy of the Supreme Court's attention. So I guess what's the big takeaway? Have a slightly more nuanced view of what the purpose of government is. Think about these two competing purposes, what that means historically, what that means for our society, what that means for government, what that means for what your elected representatives should be doing when you elect them. If you think about those things, I think you'll have a more nuanced, more sophisticated understanding of government. Maybe be a bit calmer about the passionate politics and polar politics of our contemporary American government. It's really a shame that this kind of practical problem-solving hybrid view of government isn't better appreciated by both sides, because this is the best we can do. I think we look at other societies and say, do we want an absolute dictatorship? Is that going to find the balance between individual liberty and collective good? No. So we don't have that in America. Is a pure democracy going to do that? No. A Republican government can do that better. Do we have one branch of government? No, we spread power around amongst different branches of government, but provide mechanisms for passing laws and reaching agreements and adjudicating between competing rights. And I think our point of view as Americans should probably be, and that's the best we can do. Is it perfect? Absolutely not. You know, every time there's a major historical event, or every time there's a question of safety of the common good, or every time there's a question about conflicting rights, or every time an individual's liberties are threatened, this question comes up over and over and over again. And it's naive to think that you can take one of these pure political philosophies like John Locke's view or Hobbes's view or any other pure political philosophy and take it to its logical extreme and expect that to find the balance. I think, you know, you might, I guess I would describe it as our society having the lesser of the evils, that there is no good, no absolutely good political society that answers these questions adequately. And we have a hybrid solution that's the least of the evils. We don't find the perfect balance. There are individual liberties that are being sacrificed. We don't always take the common good into account because we do emphasize the rights of the individual, but we're desperately trying, or should be trying, to find the balance between these opposing political forces and these opposing views about what the purpose of government is. And if you take one of those views to its logical extreme, you're going to run the risk of not finding the balance that we're trying to find in practical American politics, and probably failing miserably at it these days. But that's what our founding fathers had in mind in setting up the form of government that we have and the branches of government, and separating powers out and focusing on the common good, while also having a Bill of Rights that spells out what our rights are. From an individual standpoint, and that's just an irreconcilable tension that we'll never quite get outside of. So that's all I have for you guys. Do you guys have any questions or comments or concerns or maybe insights about how this applies to us, you know, contemporarily or as society going forward, or in history, or anything that happens to be of interest to you guys in relation to politics and the purpose of government?
I don't have anything specific, but I like the idea of it. I like kind of looking at how human nature sort of bleeds through society today. I like the idea of, well, okay, let's not say I like the idea. Let's say I think it's interesting that someday we'll have remnants of coronavirus in our society, in our mannerisms.
Hopefully not of the virus, but we'll probably have governmental remnants, and what it means for what people are allowed to do. It might change the way we relate to other people and one-on-one, you know, the way we greet them, the way we socialize with them. It might result in some legislation to protect people from this kind of situation again. But I think the fundamental question is going to be how much of your own liberty and how much of the way you naturally relate to other people can and should be changed to provide for the common good, to keep all of us generally safe and secure. I think it's really naive to think that an event like this will pass without some lingering effects. Just like there were some lingering effects of September 11th, just like there were some lingering effects of Pearl Harbor, or any major historical event where this issue comes up. What's interesting historically is it's too early to tell, right? We don't know what those effects are going to be, and it will be for future generations. Maybe you guys, when you're older, maybe in 100 years or 500 years, for people to look back and say, did they make the right kinds of trade-offs? Did they find an adequate balance between providing for the common good, you know, preserving everyone's safety and security, but without stepping on people's individual rights too much, you know? But every time we're asking about the common good, what we're really talking about is sacrificing individual rights, giving up some liberties. What's interesting about the way we think of it, we think of providing for the common good as a way of preserving individual rights, that preserving everyone's individual rights is also in the interest of the common good. So you could think of those as opposing forces. And I think Locke and Hobbes think of this very differently. Hobbes thinks of individual rights and the common good in opposition to each other. I think as Americans, we don't generally think that. We generally think that it's in the common good to preserve as many of our individual liberties as possible. We don't actually see that there's as much of a tension between those two factors as Hobbes thought there was, for example. But again, I think that's actually a little naive. I think that's a mischaracterization. I think that the structure of the government that the founding fathers came up with, and the basically the structure of the government, the mechanisms that are built into the government, including the tension between how, say, Congress works and the Bill of Rights, between, the way in which the different branches of government are checks on each other. All of that, I think, is in service of recognizing that there is a tension between the individual and collective society. All while saying it is in the common good to have a society where people's individual liberties and rights are generally protected. But that's an inherent tension. Again, that's a slightly more nuanced way of having the discussion. And I guess, again, we're going to wrap it up here in just a moment, but I want you guys to, whatever your political views, no matter, what views you inherited, what views you hold culturally, what, political parties you gravitate towards, I want you to keep this in mind going forward, that every time there's a political issue, the question should be coming up: how do we find the balance between individual liberty and the collective good? If that's not the focus of the discussion, then I think politically the discussion is going awry, and it's either naive or too simplistic or being taken to an extreme. This is the core of American political philosophy, is to find the balance between the individual and the common good. And pure Lockean philosophy or pure Hobbesian philosophy is not going to get you there. This is why we made the kinds of trade-offs we made in the formation of our government. And every time this question comes up: what about my rights? What about my liberties? What about my safety? What about my security? The question should be, well, how do we find the balance between the individual liberty and the common good for all of us? And if we're veering too much toward one side, we're not living, sort of American political society to its in its best, I think. So, American political philosophy and American politics and American society at its best, I think recognizes that this is a tension that will not go away. Both factors are important, and the purpose of our government is to try to find the balance between those two factors. So I guess that's the big takeaway I have for you guys. If there are no questions, feel free to ask a question now, but if there are no questions, I'll see you guys on Thursday. Make sure you do the next reading. Make sure you submit the attendance question by the end of the day. I'll have your papers graded by next week. So not by Thursday, but by next Tuesday, I'll have your papers graded. The paper instructions for paper number 4 are already posted in Blackboard. Let me know if you're planning to do either an extra credit paper. This probably doesn't apply to you guys, but anyone who's selecting option number 2 for completing the class, not doing the mind map assignments, not doing the attendance questions, but writing an additional paper, let me know and I'll provide a mechanism in Blackboard for submitting that. But I won't worry about that for the next week or so until the end of class grows nearer. If you have any questions or concerns about anything, especially about the requirements for the class, be sure to let me know. You can get a hold of me in any of the ways that you already know about. Other than that, you guys have a good day, and I'll see you guys next Thursday. On Thursday, not next Thursday, on Thursday.
Thank you.
Take care, you guys.
You too.
Bye.